Welcome to EE380. This is April
12th.
April 12th, 2023. And our speaker today is Alan Karp, who is, as I was saying earlier before we turned the recording on, he's a password mechanic and recent admitted security guru. In any case, Alan, it's all yours. Tell us about your password manager. I'm very interested.
Sure. Let me get this. I'm going to turn off my video first. So, all right, let me get started. I've attended a bunch of these talks, and I've even given some. But to be completely honest, this topic is the least significant of any of them. That said, it's the one you encounter the most often. Now, I expect that the first part of this quote sums up how you feel about passwords. But do you have any idea who said it? Well, everybody says it. And if you have any idea when it was said, we probably started using passwords. In other words, we're likely stuck with passwords for quite a while yet to come. Now, so what's so bad about passwords? Well, as usual, XKCD explains the problem best. Passwords are hard for people to remember and easy for computers to guess. And so what do we do in a situation like that? Well, one solution is to write them down. Now, I'm actually surprised that there's a market for a product like this, but apparently there is, or there was, for writing down your passwords. But perhaps a better solution is to use the computer in the form of a password manager. It's the top recommendation, but fewer than half of people actually use one. Now, I'd like to get a count out of this group, and I was going to set up a Zoom poll, but I quit reading the instructions after page 3. They were just getting too complicated. So instead, if you would just put the name of your password manager in the chat, and put none if you don't use one. And also, I'd like to know if you're happy with the password manager you're using. And for those of you who put none in the chat, I have just one thing to say: shame on you. You really should be using a password manager. There are plenty to choose from. This list is just a sample. There's dozens more. As you can see, some of them are free. Others cost a few dollars a month. And you got to be careful because every once in a while, one of them shuts down. Now, we expect certain things from a password manager. I mean, if it isn't easy to use, if it doesn't give you the warm fuzzies, if you can't get your Netflix password when you're at a friend's house, you're simply not going to use it. Nothing else matters. Of course, if it gets hacked, you're going to stop using it. That's for sure. But the difficulty using it and lack of trust are the main reasons that people give up using a password manager. Now, one important reason for using one in the first place is so you don't have to remember a different strong password for every site. Unfortunately, many password managers simply store whatever passwords you happen to use, so they don't help a lot in that regard. Also, some websites force you to change your password on a regular basis. I have a rant on why that's a bad idea, but some password managers will automate that process for you. Now, I've been talking about password managers, but I haven't actually said what they are. So Malwarebytes says that it's an application that stores your passwords. The government says it's an app on your device that stores your passwords. Consumer Reports says it's a service that stores your passwords, so it sounds like there's a consensus. A password manager stores your passwords. That definition raises some questions. So, for example, where does it store your passwords? On your machine? Well, then how do you get your passwords when you're at a friend's house? Well, that means it probably stores it in the cloud, but whose cloud? I mean, I have a cloud. I use Dropbox. I expect some of you have a cloud. My sister doesn't have a cloud. She wouldn't know what to do about that. That means your password are probably stored in the password manager's cloud. And how are they stored? Well, they're probably stored encrypted, although not every password manager does that. But then who has the encryption key? If it's them, can you trust them not to use it, not to lose it or abuse it? And if it's you, what happens if you forget your master password? And of course, it costs them money to manage those user accounts. Some of them have more than 1 million users. Managing that many users costs money, and they have to pay for the cloud resources. And then there's this to worry about. What if they get hacked? Last December, I got this notification from LastPass. Apparently, someone stole their database. Now, that revealed some customer data, but there's no evidence that any passwords were leaked, even though your protection depends solely on the strength of your master password, according to Bruce Schneier in his blog. And this is the kind of event that leads people to stop trusting their password manager. So let's think about a different approach. Instead of storing your passwords, let's calculate them. That means the tool can be free because there are no user accounts to manage or external storage to pay for. Since the calculation only needs local data, you can even use it even without a network. But the most important thing is it puts you in control. You can carry a piece of paper with everything you need to get your passwords. And it's not great if you lose that piece of paper, but it's nothing close to the problems you have if you lost that booklet with all your passwords in it. Now, I'm going to start the discussion of SitePassword with a history lesson, mainly so you can see where I stole the ideas from. So the story starts in the early 2000s. I got tired of having to remember all my passwords, and I just learned about hash functions. And I thought, maybe that can be the solution to my problem. I happened to be between projects at HP Labs, so I wrote a little Python application. And what you see here is a screenshot of a Windows executable that a colleague of mine wrote. Other people contributed other versions. One wrote a Java applet, someone else a version for Pocket PC. Others produced versions for Palm, Nokia, and the Unix command line. LastPass is a modern version of this application. And that's widely used, by the way. Now, a year or so later, people from the HP Atala division came to see us. Atala was a security company with close ties to the finance industry that HP had recently bought. And they wanted to show they had something to deal with phishing attacks at an upcoming banking conference. And they asked if we could turn the password calculator into a toolbar for Internet Explorer. Remember back in the day how everybody was producing a toolbar for Internet Explorer? So I turned to our intern, Ka-Ping Yi, and I said, how long would that take? And he said, well, a couple of weeks. And he sounded really grumpy. So after the meeting, I tracked him down and asked him what was wrong. And he said, you're treating me like a code monkey. Ping, I said, you're an intern. A code monkey is exactly what you are. And he didn't seem very happy about that answer, but as you'll see, he did quite a job. Less than 3 weeks later, we had what you see here. Ping did a spectacular job, and I learned later that he always does a spectacular job. The way it works is that green box there, you fill in a nickname for the site, here it's PayPal, and your user ID for the site. And the toolbar will remember them, so they show up automatically when you return to the site. Your master password is safely stored. So when you click on that button, you can see where the mouse is pointing. Your username and password get filled into the website. And if it's a phishing site, well, your settings won't show up. And so clicking the button does nothing. I believe this is probably the first application that deserves the term password manager, and a lot of the features that we see today. So the Atala folks showed this at the conference, and it was very well received, especially because it met the FISMA two-factor authentication requirement. They treated one factor as your master password, and the second factor is the local database holding the nicknames and your user ID for the site. As a result of that response, HP offered this as an official product. Interestingly, the product was free, but businesses could pay for a version that put their logo on the button. So if Wells Fargo wanted to distribute it to their customers, they could pay HP $1 per account and have their logo on the button. The nice part for them was that their users then would be clicking the Wells Fargo logo every time they logged in anywhere. Now, in spite of that very nice business model, I don't know if anybody actually paid. An important point about this is the Atala folks were serious security folks, and they felt that this approach was secure. It wasn't long after that that people began to recognize how vulnerable Internet Explorer was and started to migrate to other browsers, mainly Firefox. Now, I didn't really have a choice. I had to choose Chrome because the people who developed Chrome cited our research in their academic paper when they published it on the browser. So I produced a version for Chrome. Instead of a toolbar, Chrome lets developers produce plugins they call extensions. And you can see that this extension here really is a blatant copy of what Ping did. Now, I wasn't entirely happy with it. Settings are typically easier to remember most of the time, but when they're not, it's really annoying that they aren't synchronized across your machines. Personas are what you call it when you have a Facebook account for work and one for home, and you want to use different credentials for them, or you have a shared machine at home, and everyone uses the same Netflix login. That would be one persona. But each person wants their own Instagram credentials, so each person would have their own persona. Now, this version handled personas, but the code was way more complicated than I was comfortable with. And the big problem for me personally was that it only found the password field about half the time. And I found autofill to be the most user-friendly feature of the whole thing. So I put it in the Chrome store, but only available for testers. And some of them used it, some for a while. I don't know that anybody else used it for very long, but I used it for 10 years for all my passwords. And then in late 2021, Google told developers that we'd have to update our extensions. Now, at the time, I was working for a startup, and it was in the process of shutting down. So I figured I'd take a couple of weeks and make the changes. And here I am talking to you over a year later, and I only got it in the Chrome store for testing in January of this year. So the question is, why did it take me so long? Here's what the new version looks like. It's much better. That's thanks to Dale Schumacher. But that wasn't the reason for the delay. The original version used something called Google called Manifest 2, which had a persistent background page. SitePassword never stores your master password, but I could keep it in the process running the background page and be sure it was available whenever you needed to calculate a password. That's not true for the new version that has to use what Google calls Manifest 3. There's no persistent background page, just a transient service worker that can stop at any time. And when it does stop, it loses its memory. That meant I had to find a different place to remember your master password. And it turns out there's something called session storage that has all the right properties. The second complication is that almost anything you want to do with Manifest 3 involves async. Now, I've done my share of async programming. It's not my favorite, but I can do it. But this was the first time I had converted a synchronous program to async. And let me just be kind to myself and say I made more than my share of mistakes. And then, since I was out of work, I decided to fix the things I didn't like about the earlier version. For reasons I'll explain later, it took me about 6 months to get to the point where I could find the password field on every one of the 120 plus sites that I test with. I also spent a fair amount of time trying to figure out how to synchronize and how to handle personas. And then I finally came upon my solution for those two. Let Google do the heavy lifting. My trick is I store your settings in bookmarks, and that has a number of advantages. There's no need for user accounts and cloud storage. The browser takes care of the synchronization for me. The bookmarks also synchronize with your mobile devices, even without the extension installed. Each persona automatically gets its own bookmarks, so I didn't have to deal with that. You don't lose your settings if you have to reinstall the extension. I don't know if you experience this with other extensions, but if you uninstall them, typically you lose all your stored data and have to reconstruct it if you reinstall. And finally, you can use different browsers because you can import your bookmarks to them. I had to deal with one problem. Google allows you to have multiple bookmarks with the same name. That's confusing for programs. People can usually figure it out, but there's a pretty simple solution. SitePassword itself will delete will delete the duplicates automatically if they're identical, and will ask the user which one to use if they're not. And then this feature called Profiles, Google Profiles, provides everything needed to support personas. So let me give you a little taste of SitePassword, and I can show a demo later if time permits. So the first time you visit a login page after installing the extension, you'll see something like this page. And the password field says, click SitePassword. So you click on the SitePassword icon, that little thing that looks like a calculator, and you see this form that you fill in. And now you fill in the form, and you can see there you've got your SitePassword, starts with the letters T03X, right? And when you mouse out, your user ID gets filled in, and the password field says, click here for password. You click, and now you're ready to log in. Now, the best part is if you return to this page later on any machine that has the extension installed and synchronizes your bookmarks, all you have to do is click on the login field to log in. You don't have to open the pop-up. You don't have to fill in anything else. You just click and you're ready to log in. Now, remember that piece of paper I mentioned. At the bottom of here, you can see a button, Download Site Data. And it creates a file with a nicely formatted table of your settings for each site. You can print it out and carry it in your pocket. However, if you store it in the cloud, you don't even have to type in your settings. You can copy the bookmark from a link stored in that file. Remember that SitePassword started as an anti-phishing toolbar. So it warns you if you might be at a phishing site. If you open SitePassword and try to fill in a site name you'd used for a different domain, you get this big scary warning. You may not be able to read it, but what it's saying here is that the domain name with ALLAM is not the one where you set up the account. That one was ALAM, and you might be being phished here. And if you click on Get Me to Safety, it will take you back to your home page. But clicking on the red button says this is not phishing. This is just two different domain names for the same account. And it will now remember your settings so you won't see this warning again for that domain. And if you're at a friend's house, well, there's a web page for that. This would also be on your mobile device where you can't install the extension. So it's basically the same form. And if you have access to your bookmarks, you can just paste in the bookmark to get all your settings. And in this case, you can see that you've got that same password, T03X. And if you remember the settings, they'll be remembered only on this device. Now, SitePassword has extensive instructions, and my hope is that no one will ever read them. And I'll talk about that when I talk about usability. There may be times when you have to provide your own password. Maybe you can't satisfy the password rules. That's never happened in my 10 years of use and testing on over 300 sites. but there's a website called dumbpasswordrules.com, and there are actually 5 sites out of 300 some odd that I can't compute the password for. Or maybe you've been given a password and you're not allowed to change it. SitePassword will store this password for you in the bookmark, encrypted with the calculated password for this site. And that means you can even retrieve your calculated password from the bookmarks. And that's what makes this a hybrid password manager, because its primary function is to calculate passwords, but you can also use it to store them when you have to. So let's talk about usability. I mentioned earlier that that's a major reason people give up on password managers. But usability isn't quite the right thing. We're interested in usable security. And what that means is that no system can be secure if users don't understand the implications of their actions. Now, that statement, while true, isn't very helpful for designing a user experience. So I rely on Ping's 10 principles for a secure UX. And yes, that's the same Ping. Now, many of these don't apply to SitePassword, but several of them do. Make the easy way the secure way. Once you set up a site, it's actually easier to log in with SitePassword than it is to type even a simple password that you use everywhere. So we got that one covered. Explicit authorization. So we're not talking about authorizing somebody to do something on your behalf, but SitePassword won't insert your password until you click on the password field. And that has 2 effects. It avoids a particular family of attacks, but maybe equally important, it gives you control over where your password goes. SitePassword isn't about granting permissions that you might want to revoke, but you can easily forget the settings for a site by deleting its bookmark. And for expressiveness, here it's the password rules. Password rules at sites can get pretty funky. And I believe SitePassword is the only password calculator expressive enough to cover nearly all of those sites in the dumbpasswordrules.com. In addition, I have my own guidelines. I want the tools I build to be as easy to use as a game. You don't read the instructions for Candy Crush on your phone. You just play with no worries that you might break something. I also believe that a help button is a crutch for developers. I actually heard more than one say, oh, we'll just explain that in the help rather than trying to figure out how to make it obvious what to do. You also want to encourage good practices. That's why SitePassword has a strength meter for your master password, and it will let you know if a site password happens to be weak. A readable font is important. That was a hard-earned lesson for me. I didn't follow that advice, and it took me 3 tries to log into Netflix on my new smart TV because I got confused between lowercase l and uppercase I. And so I was careful about that this time. Users are often uncertain about what to do next. And so one hint you can give them is to focus on the field they need to fill in. And it seems then they'll just follow the moving cursor and go to the correct place. And then there's a pet peeve of mine. Did you ever get one of these codes texted as a second factor? And you sit there and you type it in, and when you look at the field, there's nothing there because the field wasn't focused for you? I absolutely hate that. So I try to do better than that. I haven't been completely successful. There's still some things I'm not happy with. That placeholder, click here for password, doesn't show up all the time. There are a few pages where I simply can't figure out why it's not showing. I spent the better part of a week at one website, and I never did figure out why it didn't. I resorted to a tooltip, but how do you make it obvious to the user? Hold your mouse over the password field for a second or 2. That's how long it takes for the tooltip to show up. Again, I said you sometimes want to forget the settings for a domain. You just delete the bookmark, but how do you make that obvious? I mean, you can put it in the help, but I don't want to do that. And then closing the pop-up. This was an odd problem. If I close the pop-up when it loses focus, you have to click twice to get your password, once to close the pop-up and once to insert the password. Yuck. If I close the pop-up when you mouse out, it's too easy to do that accidentally. Double yuck. So instead, what I do is I wait 3/4 of a second before closing the pop-up when you mouse out, and I keep it open if you mouse back in before it closes. I hope that's long enough that you get your mouse back and short enough that you don't have to click twice to get your password. I mean, if you get your mouse over to the password field within that 3/4 of a second and click, it'll just close the pop-up. The second important factor for a password manager is security. So let's talk about that. The situation on mobile devices is really bad. Turns out you can build an app that will find the password field, will fill in the password field of another app, and that's great. The problem is it's too easy to spoof app identity. So you might end up giving away your password. And it turns out there's a similar problem with WebView on Android. The situation is so bad that one password manager actually pulled their app out of the app store. So I'm not going to talk about mobile devices anymore. I believe all browsers these days have a built-in password manager. Typically, they're not great. Of course, they're far better than not using one at all. And as far as I can tell, they always find the password field. So you don't have to use the clipboard. You don't want to put your password on the clipboard where any other application running on your machine can read it. The big problem is that the articles on this I read say that they're not as secure as the standalone password managers, except for the fact that any password manager, any password manager that asks you to provide passwords has a usable security issue by making it too easy to just keep using weak or reused passwords. And also, the password managers that do generate passwords, few of them take into account the password rules for the site. So there may be a site where the random password generator simply can't generate an acceptable password for that site. Now, I wanted to get some experience with this. I never used those. So I set up the Chrome browser, a couple of sites with the Chrome browser. And I like to say there are 4 things a password manager should never do, and Chrome does 4.5 of them. The first thing it does that isn't good is it autofills passwords without any user action. That means your password can be stolen if a bad guy can inject a password field at any page in the domain of the login page. It could be an FAQ or a contact us page, a page that nobody thinks has any security implications. There's even an attack that only takes a few minutes to steal all the passwords your password manager is storing. There is a way that the browser can block these attacks that isn't available to extensions, but I verified that the Chrome browser doesn't do it. Another thing I couldn't figure out was how to tell the browser about the funky password rules at my power company site. It simply did not generate a legal password for that site. It allows you to encrypt your passwords, but that's not the default. And if you do, you're going to get a big scary warning. Seems odd that they want to scare you away from encrypting your passwords. The browser will warn you if you've created weak passwords, but only after you explicitly check. It doesn't tell you at the time you put them in to be managed. It also assumes that any element of type password holds a password. Now, many sites don't do that. They have other things they don't want shown on the screen, and the only way to replace it with dots is to put call it an input field of type password. But if they don't think it's a password, they might not give it as much effort as they should in protecting it. Now, one thing interesting is that it uses the same password for smile.amazon.com and amazon.com, which is great. But it doesn't use the same password for amazon.co.uk. It turns out that this is a very hard problem to know if two domain names are for logging into the same account. Now, it could be that they're checking the TLS certificate, but I can't be sure. And Google doesn't make the TLS certificate available to extensions, so I can't test it myself in my extension. I think the minuses of using the built-in password managers outweigh the pluses, so I'm not going to talk about them further. But getting a different strong password for every site is just the beginning of password manager security. I've already mentioned the problems with autofill, and we've seen that the databases holding your passwords can be stolen. But warning the user about weak and reused passwords is also important. Now, there's an example here, there's OMMMM thing. There's a guy for his PhD thesis. One of the things he did was he had a password manager generate 140 million random passwords. And about a dozen of them were easy to guess. For example, the one shown here can be guessed in about 10 seconds at 1 million guesses per second. So, as I mentioned, SitePassword has a strength meter, so people will know if they've got a strong master password. I don't enforce that, but I'll let you know if it's weak. Also, your site password will be in a noticeable color if SitePassword should accidentally compute a weak one. And that's why the provided site password I showed you earlier was green. That's used to indicate that it was okay, not weak, but not great either. I think your password manager should warn you if you're at a possible phishing site. But if you're using ones that store your password, you also have to be worried about being phished for your password manager password. I mean, what's to prevent a malicious web page from showing you a form that just looks just like your password managers? Then I mentioned the problem of Amazon.com and Amazon.co.uk. It sure would be nice if you could tell you were both for logging in to the same account. I spent some time trying to figure it out, and I failed. There is a very nice piece of code. It's very highly upvoted on Stack Overflow. And it tells you that you should use the same password for mail.google.com and maps.google.com. That's good. Unfortunately, it also says you should use that same password for google.evil.com, which is probably not a good idea. Accessibility features are interesting. For example, you don't want a screen reader to say your passwords out loud when you're in a public place. The other issue is the size of the code. Some of the open source tools I looked at are gigantic. One's over 250,000 lines of code. SitePassword is just about 1% of that. And of course, that means I only produced about 10 lines of code per workday, and I don't know how happy you'd be if I was part of your team and when you were in a rush. I also think it's a big problem when login pages rely on jQuery. Don't get me wrong, I love jQuery. I think it reads your mind. It does what you want, not what you said. But it is a big dependency, and with all the issues we have on supply chain attacks, I don't think it should be on a security critical page. Particular SitePassword is self-contained. It never talks on the network once it's been loaded. But worst of all is a password manager that doesn't convey trust, that doesn't give you the warm fuzzies I mentioned, because then you'll give up using password managers, and that's the worst of all. So how does SitePassword do on the security? Well, I think I've done a pretty good job. You have to click on the password field, and that blocks an entire family of attacks. I only register the callback for putting the password in the field when you click, on visible password fields, and that will defeat some clickjacking attacks. That's where they put an invisible field on the page, and you think you're clicking on something underneath it, but you're actually clicking on the thing there. I won't be putting your password into that field. I use the iframe domain name when I look up the settings to use for calculating the password. That's the right thing to do, because you wouldn't want an ad on a page to, get your New York Times password just because it was on the same page as nytimes.com. But that also means that users will see a bookmark with a strange domain name. I don't know quite what to do about that. It used to be that determining if a password was strong was difficult. There was a lot of disagreement about what that meant, but Dropbox produced this very nice tool, which is the one I use. It's so good. SitePassword distribution without it is less than 100 kilobytes. But that tool is so good that I'm using it even though the distribution is now just over a megabyte. There's also the case that attackers produce what are called rainbow tables. They will pre-compute the hash of all possible passwords up to some size, 8, 12, even 14 characters. I mean, terabytes of data in these tables. And then if they get the hash of a password, it's just a lookup to find the actual password. But that might work for a site password because the site itself doesn't add what's called salt. But your master password is safe from that because it's combined with your user and site names to produce your site password. And of course, I've mentioned it's not a good idea to leave a password on the clipboard any longer than necessary. So SitePassword lets you know if you might have done that. There are places where I made compromises in the interest of usability. So for example, I put things in unencrypted bookmarks. Now, bookmarks are very well protected from code running on web pages, but not from malware on your machine. They're just stored in a file on your machine. Of course, if you got malware on your machine, you've got bigger problems than losing your settings. And Google has them in the Google Cloud for the synchronization. But if Google gets hacked, well, life as we know it ends. So I'm not going to worry about that. I chose to make the site password visible by default. Watching it change as you type gives you a sense of how uncorrelated your passwords are. And besides, you rarely have to open the pop-up. It's just to set up a new site or enter your master password at the start of a browser session, or on the rare cases when you have to put it on the clipboard. And I originally chose a 12-character site password because back when the first time I did this, too many sites wouldn't take longer ones. That's less of a problem now, but there are still some that require that size or shorter. Then there's the ugly. There's a serious attack against your master password. It's no worse than against the stolen password database, but it is there. It turns out there are two kinds of guessing attacks against passwords. In an online attack, the bad guy goes to a bank login page, enters your user ID, and starts guessing passwords. That's about all an attacker who gets just your bookmarks can do. They know where you log in and what your user ID is, but no clue about your site or master passwords. This attack is slow and it's easily detected, so we don't have to worry about that. Offline attacks are more serious. So if the attacker steals a password database, which stores the hashes of users' passwords and starts guessing, that can be fast and undetectable. And that attack is still there with SitePassword, but it works differently. Say that you create an account at a rogue site. The bad guy now knows your user ID and site password and can probably guess your nickname for the site. And now he starts guessing master passwords. Now, you can't eliminate that threat with SitePassword, but you can mitigate it with a strong master password. According to that Dropbox tool, it would take 3 days to guess a 12-character password at 1 million guesses per second. It would take centuries if you use 15 characters. SitePassword also increases the work needed for a guess by hashing 100 times before showing a site password. That means at 1,000,000 guesses per second, it would take almost a year to guess even a 12-character master password. But then there's a mitigation that's not available for the managers that store your passwords. You can use different master passwords for different uses, one for banking and health, another for subscriptions, and a third one for sketchy sites. Use that third one at that rogue site, your money is still safe. Now, one of the things I miss from not going to the office is hearing other people's war stories, the crazy stuff they ran into and how they dealt with it. I hope you enjoy mine. Websites do some really weird, we'll call it stuff. As I said, it took me 6 months to find the password fields on all of my test sites. So here I'll tell you what some of those issues were. So it's quite common to put a password field in an iframe, and that was the most common reason the earlier version didn't find the password field. Fixing that got me from 50 or so of my test sites to over 80. Several sites build the page when you load the URL. If you do a view source, you're only going to see a few lines of HTML. Fortunately, there's something in JavaScript called a mutation observer that lets you know when the web page is changed. And so doing that got me 20 more sites. The rest of these changes got me a couple each. A few sites create the password field as a normal text field, and later on change the input type to password. Unfortunately, that doesn't count as a mutation, so I had to add special code. Dropbox, I don't know if they still do, I forgot to check for this talk, used to have 6 password fields on the page with only one of them visible when you were logging in. And it turns out that determining visibility is quite tricky, and I'm going to show you in a moment. There are sites, 2 of my test sites, actually add CSS at runtime that takes an invisible password field and makes it visible. And that too doesn't count as a mutation, so I had to write more special code. And then several sites don't make the password visible until after you fill in your user ID, which means I can't fill it in for you. But once you do, I've been able to find the password field every time. More crazy stuff. One site actually changes the look of the login form depending on the URL you use to get there. And that required even more special code. One site puts the login form in something called a shadow root. I bet you don't know what that is. I've never heard of it. It was designed to completely isolate a document inside the main document. And that's a great idea, except I've been told by someone who knows that the design is so flawed that it's not particularly useful, but did require more special code. And then there's the bank that clears the username and password field 2 seconds after I fill them in. Not if I type them in, but if they're auto-filled by SitePassword. I have no idea what that's for. And I couldn't even figure out where in their code they were doing it, even though I single-stepped through thousands of lines of code. The workaround, more special code. And finally, I loaded up the website, sitepassword.info, for testing, and the password field said click SitePassword, which I found annoying. So I had to add a special case for that URL. Finding out if an element is visible is quite a challenge. There is something called window.computedStyle that gets it right every time, except when it doesn't. And when it doesn't, you have to go look at something called the offset parent. Turned out it wasn't quite working for me, and I couldn't figure out why. Turned out that that test in green was on the documentation page, but I only saw it when I accidentally scrolled the page. It was just off the piece of code that I was looking at. That was 2 days down the drain out of 6 months. And then there are many ways to make a field invisible, but a common one is to set the opacity to 0 or a very small value. There is a test, element.style.opacity, but if the opacity is 0, the field is still reported as visible. Now, this one's an easy one since there's no good reason to change the visibility of a login. Well, having found the password field, how do you find the user ID field? You notice I fill in the user ID for you. What I found is most password managers use the simple heuristic of choosing the input element immediately preceding the password element. There are often intervening input fields, but they're almost never visible, except for one of my 120 plus sites. In that one, I don't get the username in the right field. At least one other password manager gets it right. And my understanding is they actually have a special case just for that one website. I just can't bring myself to do that. And then there's the really crazy stuff. Things you might expect from your corner bagel shop who hired the neighbor's teenager to build their website. But these are major banks and retail companies. As we've seen, there can be multiple domain names for the login page. One bank has securo1.bank.com, securo2.bank.com. I've seen securo7.bank.com. Each one of those is going to show up as a phishing warning the first time you encounter a new one, because I can't be sure that it's really bank1.com is the actual site. My health insurance company is training me to be phished. They have me, when I click the button to log in, they take me to a completely different website. There's a rule in HTML that any element can be given an ID. That's how you say, I want to associate this piece of code when you click that element. And almost anything will do. The only rule is that IDs have to be unique or all hell will break loose. Well, good rule. Don't count on it. One major store uses the same ID for the username and password elements, which means I had to spend a day going back and changing my code because I was using the ID to track them. Companies also work really hard to improve the performance of their web pages, but you'd never know it by looking at the developer's console. There's often a gazillion errors. A particularly egregious example took 30 seconds for the page to finish loading, which meant SitePassword couldn't show you your username for that long. And of course, your first reaction is there's something wrong with SitePassword. The cause turned out to be 4 failed gets, which were done sequentially, each one timing out after 7.5 seconds. I went back to show someone this problem, but they've changed how they do the login, so that's no longer a problem. But I still have to have code in my distribution to deal with that case. So how bad is all of this craziness? One password manager has special cases for over 200 sites, and I guess they got people tracking those sites in case they change how they do things. All right, time to wrap up. For future work, I'd love to do user studies, but that's really hard for someone working alone. So I'm asking for your help. If you're willing, try it out and give me your feedback. A security review would be nice, but paying for one is certainly out of my price range, unless somebody wants to volunteer. SitePassword now works on all the major browsers, Safari, Firefox, and most Chromium browsers, Brave, Edge, Opera. But I need to do a lot more testing on them. And I'm keeping my eye on mobile, but I won't be building a SitePassword app until those security issues I talked about get fixed. Here's where I got most of my information. Don't bother copying them down. You can get them from that GitHub site. Ping's 10 principles, that's a paper worth reading. Anything Ping writes is worth reading. He really has interesting ideas and writes quite well. The Osh thesis is absolutely amazingly comprehensive, and the paper provides a good summary. So takeaways, use a password manager. Can't stress that enough. My son uses the one built into Chrome. And in spite of all the problems I pointed out, I haven't told him not to use it out of fear he won't use a password manager at all. Some autofill without user action, turn that off, or be very careful about using public Wi-Fi. If you find a replacement, if you find a replacement, use that tool. Be ready in case they raise their prices too much for you or go out of business. And make sure you use strong passwords, even if the manager lets you use weak ones. Or use SitePassword and be in control. And that's it. Thanks. I'll take questions now.
Any questions? It was a great talk, Alan.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that I think it'll be a popular YouTube reading from the thing, because we'll may modify the title just a little bit to make it more of a how-to.
Okay. Yeah.
But I think it's really very nice, nice gathering of things.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Well, if anybody wants to volunteer, you can contact me at alanhkarp@gmail.com.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm looking for testers.
There have been people who wanted to do sites without passwords and do biometrics.
Mm-hmm.
What's your feeling on this?
I think it's wonderful. The problem is, can the electronic signal that represents the biometric be replicated and captured by bad guys?
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem. Mark Stigler produced a system where when you create your account, you're given a bookmark. You bookmark that, and it's got an unguessable URL in it. And so all you have to do is click on your bookmark to log in. The problem there is you can't log in from a friend's house if you don't have your bookmarks. So
unless you distribute it to all people at all times.
Yeah, right. So that you don't want to do that for, if you didn't want that, you wouldn't be using passwords in the first place. So,
that's true.
There was at IBM in the 80s, there was a discussion about what the company, should the company do something company-wide about passwords. And so they got together a group of smart people who decided that they wouldn't be using passwords for very long anyway, so it wasn't worth the effort.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know.
Well, when I looked at the Android stuff, and they have, my phone has a sensor on the back.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out that it's very useful. It's a good two-factor authenticator and so forth and so on, but it's not very good compared to maybe 4 or 5 letters in sequence on a type-in.
Well, a lot of it comes down to usability.
Mm-hmm.
There's the gag about why is mommy crying, and the answer is two-factor authentication.
Okay.
So it's got to be usable by ordinary people who have more interesting things to do than worry about computer security.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a wonderful paper about how to phones which you use for two-factor authentication, how you can spoof them. It's not very difficult.
Well, there are, so if it's the kind of code where the web page says we just texted you a code, type it into this web page, that's pretty easy for a man in the middle to defeat. The ones that use a back channel, where they put up a QR code on the page, you scan it with the phone, and the phone contacts the server by a different channel. Those are much harder for attackers to get into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but what you have to make assumptions about what physical devices people have. I mean, the the FIDO keys, the YubiKeys. That's a wonderful second factor. I use mine a lot.
Anyhow, thank you very much. It looks
Yeah,
to me
well-
like we don't have any comments, and that I think is the definition of a really good talk. Thank you, Michael.
Okay. All
It's
right.
really, really great. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. All right. Good talking to you. Bye.
Great. Goodbye.